The Exorcist is up there among the top horror films of all time. Whether you find it the most bone-chilling or most boring film, you can't deny the impact it's had not only on the horror film industry, but on society too. The Exorcist, directed by William Friedkin, who was insanely weird and abusive during filming, was released in cinemas in the United States in December of 1973 and produced $441 million at the box office worldwide. The film is based on the book The Exorcist by William Peter Blatty. What I find fascinating, and what we'll be talking about today, is the timing of the film. What was going on in the world at the time of its release, and the subsequent reaction from the public upon its release. The plot follows Chris MacNeil, played by Ellen Burstyn, and her daughter Regan, played by Linda Blair. Chris is an actress and is temporarily in Georgetown working on a new film. Both Chris and Regan are staying in a super fancy house with staff and seem to have a sweet mother-daughter relationship. Chris and Regan's father are no longer together, with the split being apparent in scenes regarding his lack of effort in spending time with his daughter. I'll explain the significance of this later on. The plot also follows a priest based in Georgetown, Father Damien Karras. He struggles with his faith and fitting into the priesthood. When Regan gets possessed and becomes volatile, Father Karras gets involved with helping Father Merrin, an elderly priest who specialises in exorcisms, to exorcise the spirit from Regan. There are several points that I'll be pulling from the plot to explain what the film means, especially from a Catholic perspective. These points include the age and gender of Regan/the possessed, Father Damien Karras struggling with his faith, and the broken home narrative/the career-centric woman. The end of the 1960s was traumatic, with the Charles Manson murders bringing the decade to an abrupt close. From the 1960s going into the 1970s, there was an increase of civil unrest, including public dissatisfaction with the ongoing Vietnam War and Cold War and the treatment of the black population in the United States at that time. It's safe to say that in the golden hue decade of the 1960s, it was a lot more sinister than what we like to imagine, and this was carried into the 1970s. Whilst there was major dissatisfaction for Native Americans, Black people, Asian people, and BIPOC immigrant populations in the US since the beginning of the country's founding, the white population of the country was realising throughout the 1960s that it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. They were waking up to the injustices that had been prevalent in their country since the pioneers first stepped foot there. From 1970 to 1973, there were several incidents that shook the white Christian American psyche. There was the case of Jeffrey R. MacDonald, who murdered his young family, including his pregnant wife, in 1970. There was the Roe v. Wade US Supreme Court decision overturning state bans on abortion. There were the criminal prosecutions against the New Haven Nine, threats from President Nixon to extend the Vietnam War, the war on drugs, and the Kent State shootings, all within a few years. As Roger Ebert states in his 1973 review of The Exorcist, it may be that the times we live in have prepared us for this movie. With this unrest happening in the background and lead up to 1973, the white Christian community were now faced with the realisation that they too could become victims. Their cushy spot at the top of the social hierarchy wasn't stable anymore. The Christian ideal was no longer recognised as top priority, as their children were leaving their homes and moving to corrupted cities to find themselves. With the US film industry being dominated by white Christians, it's easy to see the reflections of what was happening in society reproduced for the big screen. And what I think horror films do, if done well, is reflect society's insecurities and fears at that moment in time. Religion obviously plays a massive part of The Exorcist, with exorcisms being largely, at least in the West, a Catholic ritual. Today we may see exorcisms as archaic or barbaric, however, even when I was growing up, they seemed a very real cure to possession. For those who are unaware, Possession is the process of a demonic or evil spirit entering a human body, effectively taking charge of that person. I'm not sure if this is believed in all our Christian religions, but in Catholicism, demons are thought to roam the earth looking for people to possess in order to win souls for Satan. And what's even more terrifying is that this can happen to anyone. Catholics believe that you're more susceptible to possession if you're a devout follower of God, or going through puberty, or divorced, or your parents are divorced, or you have problems with addiction. The underlying theme of all of these is that a person is going through emotional turbulence. This leaves a person vulnerable to spiritual attacks and ultimately possession. In The Exorcist, Regan is a young girl, around 12 or 13 years old, who gets possessed. Her character is sweet and charming, and she has a loving relationship with her mother. The exorcism of Regan is based on the real-life case of Roland Doe, a pseudonym. Roland's exorcism was the inspiration for Blatty's writing of The Exorcism. This exorcism has since been debunked, with information largely based on hearsay and word of mouth. However, I think it's worth noting the change of gender of the possessed in the book and film. The explanation as to why the possessed person in the book and film is a young girl and not a young boy, which would have been a lot closer to the real story, is not a massive mystery. When we think of the most innocent lives, we think of young girls and women, almost always white girls and women. And this is no accident. We're told that boys and men are more capable of handling themselves, so when tragedy befalls them, they're seen less as victims. This flavour of sexism is damaging to everyone, as it perpetuates the idea of women and girls being vulnerable and helpless, and men and boys not being as important or overlooked in times of need. Khadija Mbowe has an incredible video on missing white woman syndrome, which goes into depth of the role of race and how the media portrays tragedies, which I'll link in the cards and description below. Regan, therefore, being only 12 or 13, and a lovely daughter, friendly to the household staff and everyone she meets, is the ideal character to get possessed. Her age holds significance, as I've mentioned earlier. People going through puberty are seen as more susceptible to possession, as it's a period of emotional turbulence in their lives. What is also significant is that young Regan is also very aware of her parents' divorce. Chris, her mother, argues on the phone with Regan's father, and Regan listens in. A broken home is also seen as an entryway for demons, since in Catholicism, and maybe wider Christianity too, marriage is a sacrament. It's a binding agreement with God that two people will remain together forever. When this is broken, you're defying the agreement made with God, so you're ultimately seen as a bad person. This again feeds into the emotional turbulence that a demon can sense and use as a reason to latch on to a person. I think it's also worth noting that Chris MacNeil is a single parent who has a brilliant career. With the rise of Christian fundamentalism at the time of the film's release, and with the women's liberation movement, it's interesting to see Chris manage motherhood. I believe that these two pillars, Christian fundamentalism and women's lib, would be the two stages of interpreting Chris MacNeil. The former demonising her as the reason for her daughter's possession, the latter praising her for not only raising a well-rounded child, but achieving great career success. Christian fundamentalists believe in strict gender roles, with men leading a family and women supporting their aims. Chris flips this on its head, going against the typical Christian narrative and undermining what the church believes women are capable of. Chris can be seen as both a threat and an example, depending on how you want to view her. A threat to gender roles, as she is a successful woman and mother, and an example of how when a divorced woman focuses on her career, things can go awry. Chris is interesting as she can be used to argue either point. Father Damien Karras seems disinterested in his vocation from the get-go. His frustration with being referred to as father and overall lack of interest in helping people presents an interesting image of a priest. When speaking to priests in the past, I've heard them say that they received a calling from God to do his work. It's a defining moment that solidifies their faith and encourages them on the path of Christ. Father Karras does not appear to share the same sentiment. It's as if he's a priest because his Italian family views it as a respectable profession, so he went along with it. What's interesting is his insistence that Reagan is psychologically disturbed, using 1970s terminology here. The coupling of his lack of faith and disbelief in Chris's claims that her daughter is possessed is important to the narrative of the story. Desperate to ensure that her daughter was safe and back to normal, Chris pursued all paths, initially laughing at the idea of possession. However, as matters got worse, she had little other option but to believe in it. Father Karras faced a similar situation, as his faith is teased and questioned by the demon possessing Reagan, and he's taunted by the demon regarding his mother's death. Seeing and hearing from Reagan things that nobody else could possibly know, Father Karras begins to reckon with the fact that Reagan is possessed. William Peter Blatty, author of the book, was a Roman Catholic. In 2012, he filed a canon law petition against his alma mater, Georgetown University, which he claimed to be at the variance with Catholic Church teachings, inviting speakers who support abortion rights and disobeying Pope John Paul II's instructions issued to the church-affiliated colleges and universities in 1919. I mention this because it's clear to see the message being made by the role of Father Karras. The exorcism ritual must be performed by a priest with unfaltering faith. Father Karras picked up the metaphorical torch as he carries on with the exorcism when Father Merrin dies, placing all of his faith in God in that moment. It's quite the powerful image, and an equally powerful statement to make in 1973. The Exorcist was released on December 26, 1973, one day after Christmas, the highlight of the Christian calendar. We've touched on why the 1960s and 1970s could be considered traumatic for white Christians in the United States. In the UK, the film was removed from the shelves and remained prohibited for 11 years. Looking back to the time when The Exorcist was released, it's easy to see it as a cultural event. What ensued after the release of The Exorcist was a wave of reports of people being possessed. A New York Times article from 1974 states that Chancery officials have been confronted with a wave of inquiries from persons who believe that they, or their acquaintances, are possessed by demons. Theologians have warned that the film distorts church teachings. This period of mass hysteria is a phenomenon. The collective delusion that people were becoming possessed after watching The Exorcist eventually created a mass panic that pervaded social thinking and reactions.
The crowds were so intense at all the theaters that they became a police concern. Uniformed guards were hired in all instances to keep thoroughfares clear and prevent violation of the lines.
On the more orderly line. You're blocking the sidewalk.
When speaking to the New York Times, the Reverend Richard Woods at Loyola University in Chicago stated that he had received dozens of calls from people who were horribly frightened or so confused that they had begun to lose their grip on reality. He also knew of 2 kids who came out of the movie thinking that they were possessed and had since been hospitalized. In Georgetown, the Reverend Edmund G. Ryan stated that people are coming from all over to see the chapel, to hear Mass, to discuss exorcism. The ritual of exorcism, which persists in vestigial form in the modern baptismal rite, was developed as a means of regularizing the Church's approach to such situations and is essentially a prayer invoking the power of God. Until 1972, when several minor orders of ministry were eliminated, new priests were routinely ordained as exorcists. These testimonies from American priests at that time offer a glimpse into the public's thinking. If you've ever watched a horror film that scared the hell out of you, you know the adrenaline that courses throughout your body. Imagine having never seen something as visceral as The Exorcist. Horror movies, up until then, were fairly tame in comparison, so it's no wonder why The Exorcist sparked something in the public. In the Catholic Church, there were grumblings of change from the 1960s. Responding to the social unrest and revolutions across many countries, the Vatican underwent a reform. Vatican II was established as the new way the Catholic Church worked, modernising practices and positions. When The Exorcist was released, there were reports of people fainting, vomiting, and convulsing when watching it. The United States Conference of Catholic Bishops' Office of Film and Broadcasting, also known as the USCCB/OFB, officially and publicly condemned the film as being unsuitable for a wide audience, but reviews produced for the office by priests and lay Catholics, and correspondence between priests and the USCCB/OFB show that the Church at least notionally interpreted it as a positive response to the power of faith. The Catholic Church was concerned about the misconceptions of the Church teachings and practices that were catching like wildfire amongst the public. The film was criticised on the basis that it simplified the battle of good and evil, with a priest stating that the film is fundamentally immature. Being a Christian, an immature person, means coming to terms with our own capacity for evil, not projecting it on an outside force that possesses us. It's eerie to hear a Catholic priest explain the true forces of evil in everyday life. I agree that we can project the atrocities we commit on an outside force that has possessed us. But if we realise that our own capacity for evil extends to harming others, then we must do more than simply recognise it. Although the official Catholic response to the film was relatively tame, what has been happening since 1973 is a rise in people using biblical teachings to limit social progress. Films like The Exorcist stoke the imagination into thinking what could happen. As reported on after the film's release, people began going to mass and developed an interest in the church. During the lead up to 1973, there were plenty of events that could be viewed as having pushed white Christian Americans into seeking further comfort within the church. With the rise in equal rights protests, the ongoing Vietnam and Cold Wars, and the women's liberation movement, it's easy to see how someone could view The Exorcist as an example of what could happen when things get out of control. If we could all just revert back to the good old days, then none of this would happen. Maybe not necessarily the possession of a child, but the undoing of a family. Chris McNeil is a single mother with a career who lost control of her family. Father Damien Karras had denied and doubted his faith and met his death attempting to fight evil. As stated earlier, the Church at least interpreted The Exorcist as a positive response to the power of faith. I see it as a culmination of the fear amongst white Christians in the US at the time during a crucial period of unrest and progress. I want to clarify and say that I'm no longer a practicing Catholic. I grew up in the Catholic faith and many of my family members are still practicing Catholics, but I no longer want to be associated with the Catholic Church. Growing up, I watched a lot of horror films, and I remember praying incredibly hard when I couldn't sleep at night. I love horror films and I love discussing them at a very high level like what I did here in this video, but I don't want there to be any confusion with where I stand. I believe the Catholic Church limits social progress, and there have been too many real-life horror stories where priests and nuns have been behind it all. If there's any money made from this video, I'll be donating 50% of its earnings to the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. I've linked their website in the description box, so please consider donating if you're able to. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please consider giving it a like, and if you're interested in discussing horror films, games, and anything else, please consider subscribing. Thanks very much for watching, and take care of yourselves.